Welcome. I'm Carol Christ. I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Higher Education. And it's always such an honor to introduce Mark Richards. I got to know Mark when he was Dean of Physical Sciences. He served as Dean of Physical Sciences for, I think, Math and Physical Sciences for, I think, 12 years. And also was Executive Dean of the College of Letters and Science. And I think of Mark as a dean that has had perhaps more impact than most other deans because he has deep commitments to diversity, to the hiring of women in STEM fields, to undergraduate teaching. And if you read a list of the innovations that he introduced, he established CalTeach, he established SMASH, he established the Berkeley Science Network programs, the Teaching Excellence Colloquia, and Big Ideas courses, all of which have become really embedded in the texture of both the physical sciences and indeed the campus at large. Mark is a professor in earth and planetary sciences. He's an eminent researcher that works on the relationship between the kind of deep interior of the Earth and processes like earthquakes and volcanoes. Mark has been involved in research on graduate students, underrepresented minorities in STEM fields, and he has some very exciting research to present to us today. So, Mark, thanks so much for presenting.
Thank you, Carol. First of all, just let me say how lucky Berkeley is that Carol returned to us after an extended sabbatical in the East. And it's so wonderful to have you back running CSHE, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. So let me start off by asking you all to think about a question. I want you all to think about, what do you think is the most important scientific or engineering problem of our age, maybe the one that you're most interested in? Climate change, energy, finding gamma rays, Steve. What is it? Okay. The reason that I'm here is that I think the most important science and engineering problem facing our country is the lack of diversity of the workforce in science and engineering. Because all those other problems require that we put forth the best energies we have as a nation and as a people to solve them. And we're not doing that. And as our population of underrepresented students grows without concomitant growth in the STEM fields, and as women continue to be disproportionately underrepresented in the STEM workforce, we're missing a lot of talent, a lot of energy, not to mention social justice, equity, and the very definitions of the problems that we think are important to solve. How many of you have seen the movie The Martian? I'm going to freely admit, I absolutely loved the movie. If you see it in 3D. It's sappy, it's Hollywood, but the heroes are all nerds. And the nerds are about half women, and by far my favorite two heroes, nerd heroes in the movie, are African American, especially the guy who does the calculations, I won't spoil the movie for you. Hollywood is clearly ahead of the Academy and Silicon Valley in this regard. And so I've had the privilege, and I really mean privilege, over the last decade as a dean, up until a year and a half ago when they relieved me. I didn't mean it to sound quite that way, but of learning things and having an opportunity to contribute. And I'm going to have an opportunity to acknowledge a good many members of the team here a little bit later today. But the problem, the motivating problem is as follows, and it's what I call the shrinking pipeline. Here at Berkeley, for example, we have about half the students who come as freshmen to UC Berkeley as undergraduates now indicating that they want to major in STEM fields. It's actually quite remarkable, which compares to a national peer average of about 34%. Okay? However, if you look at the pipeline nationally and more or less reflected in numbers at Berkeley, about 25% of the students who are entering freshmen and sophomores who declare or indicate interest in STEM are underrepresented minority students. By the time you get to the graduate programs, it's about 10%. By the time you start filling elite postdoctoral positions and assistant professorships in first-rate universities, it's about 3 to 4%. Now, if you're counting, that's about a factor of 6 loss. Assuming that the representation initially at 25% isn't bad, because it actually is representative of underrepresented students at the campus as a whole. And to break this down just a little bit, and a more stark concern that we have is that if you look at the freshmen entering Berkeley who, and this is actually true nationally, although we have the merit of being one of the few universities who will actually own up to this publicly, about of the students who declare interest in STEM and begin pursuing majors in STEM fields, and particularly mathematical and physical sciences at Berkeley, about 1/3 of the white and Asian male students will persist to their degrees, which may be an appropriate number. I mean, people change their mind, right, and discover other things. About 50% of the women who indicate that interest persist to STEM degrees, and about 1/3, only about 1/3 of the underrepresented students who declare an interest. So we're losing about 1/3 of white and Asian males, about 50% of women, and about 2/3 of underrepresented minority students. And there are many, many reasons for that. One particular reason we know of that is absolutely obvious and indisputable is the lack of professors of color and women professors who are role models and create a psychological atmosphere where people feel comfortable and welcome and belonging to the field. And so I would say that as dean and with my team, we have concentrated on many things regarding diversity, but one of the things we've concentrated on the most is to try to break or to plug this leak, particularly the leak that occurs between graduate school and the professoriate. That's a factor of 2. And in my view, that's low-hanging fruit. These are people, if we have just 10% underrepresentation in our graduate programs, that's bad enough. But if we drop to 3 to 4% by the time we get to the professoriate, that's a catastrophe. And it's an unnecessary one. And it's one that we think there have to be answers. Now, those answers are not easy in coming. And I need to make an admission to everybody in this audience right now. This is my very first social science talk. Okay? I'm used to, figuring out how the plates move and how the dinosaurs got killed. And that's my comfort zone. And I want to say to the scientists here that there's a reason that I decided that I should give this talk rather than social scientists on my team who could actually do a better job. And the reason is that we need to learn to work together as scientists, engineers, and social scientists. And there are 2 extremes that we need to avoid. One is what I call the cowboy extreme, where we scientists seem to make assumptions and think we know what's wrong and go in and fix it. And the other is, what? Oh, somebody was waving at me. And the other is the extreme that some colleagues may advocate from the other side, which I would call the kind of psychological engineering side, where knights in white armor ride in from the social sciences and tell us how to behave and fix our problems in the sciences. Neither one of these really work very well. And there's a lot of proof that they don't work very well, I think. So I'm out here taking the bullets today and really presenting what I have to present today, as much of an exercise in trying to learn from you and your responses as presenting you with some findings that we have, and we do have some interesting findings. The programs that we have at Berkeley include the Berkeley Science Network, Berkeley Science Connections, the SMASH program that is a high school program that we've worked with the Kapor Foundation on, and also the NSF AGEP supported California Alliance, which involves Berkeley, UCLA, Stanford, and Caltech. And as I've told people, this is probably the first time these 4 institutions have worked together on anything since the Manhattan Project. And it's not exactly clear. I'm not sure that's a proud analogy, but it's been interesting, let me say. So let me just start off by talking about BLISS, the Berkeley Life and Science Survey, and where this came from. And I'm going to start off by introducing the team, many of whom are here and can stand up and stick up their hands if they want to. Rudy Mendoza-Denton from the Psychology Department, Aaron Fisher, also from Psychology, Colette Patt, Diversity Officer for Physical Sciences, Andrew Epic from Equity and Inclusion, an analyst, Ira Young, who runs the BSN, BSc program, formerly of chemistry, Jeff Royal, whom I don't believe is here, and myself. This has really been an incredible group of people to work with, and with amazing backgrounds. The survey itself, I think, the hero's work of collecting, soliciting, collecting responses is Rudy and Colette and Ira and Jeff that I know of, and probably a few other people. The reason we did this survey, let me tell you a little bit about the background, because it's important to know why we did what we did. First of all, it was supported by both the National Science Foundation and the Mitchell Kapor Foundation, primarily the latter. And their focus, and in many ways our focus, has been to go at the hardest problems of all, which are in the mathematical and physical sciences and computer science area. Also, there's a certain coherence to that. The biological sciences are different. Frankly, they're doing better in most areas of diversity. And the other engineering disciplines, there are many reasons we didn't do all of engineering, but I won't go into them here. But computer science is closely allied with, of course, mathematics, and it kind of fits. Also, we needed to kind of a tractable population of students and faculty and so forth. The idea behind the survey was actually quite simple. There's a lot of social science research that tells us things about how psychological factors affect people's performance, especially in regard to diversity, and perhaps the most eminent leader in that particular field is now our provost here, Claude Steele. But there are many other, there's an enormous body of literature Rudy has contributed to, and many others on this subject. And what we have a pretty good idea of is, and this was our going-in hypothesis, which turns out to have kind of been shoved aside, but I want to tell you what it is anyway because it motivated the study, was that if we can measure certain psychological attributes of respondents and students and so forth, and also get some quantitative information on the, what kind of services and mentoring and so forth they're receiving, that if you understand some things about the psychology of what's going on among our students, then you can extrapolate via the social science research as to what effects might be happening and how to ameliorate them, because you can't do everything all at once, and we didn't have a longitudinal base long enough to actually look at outcomes. So the idea was to do several different surveys and see if we were moving the needle in certain of these areas with the very programs that I mentioned, particularly ones that Ira is involved with, the Berkeley Science Network and mentoring, vertically and horizontally integrated mentoring networks and so forth. So that's a lot of background, and I wanted you to have a little bit of an idea of how this came about, because as is true with almost every good scientific endeavor I've ever been involved with, where you start off going isn't where you end up arriving. And surprises are all about. So we surveyed both graduate students and undergraduate students, and it was a Herculean effort. These are the ends, if you will, the data on the students surveyed. For graduates, non-underrepresented minority men, 555 were solicited for responses and 218 responded. Underrepresented minorities, 109 were solicited, 55 responded, so 50% response rate. These response rates are pretty good. Those of you who work in survey research know that they're not great, but they are certainly better, for example, than the Berkeley Climate, or the UC Climate Survey overall. And in fact, at Berkeley, I believe we sampled many more underrepresented minority students and both undergraduate and graduate than were sampled in that survey. And obviously we are biased, our sampling is biased toward trying to get representative numbers in all these categories, And so we asked a greater proportion of underrepresented students to respond than we did majority students, and so forth. And we were surveying in chemistry, EECS, mathematical and physical sciences. That's what M and PS means. And of some kind of roughly balanced numbers among these fields, which will come into play a little bit later. About an equal number of men and women, and a regrettably small number of underrepresented minorities, but sad to say, this is a very large number compared to what any other institution in the country could probably come up with. And we grant more PhDs, I think, to underrepresented minorities than anybody else in the country right now. The undergraduate numbers are similar. I won't go over them because I'm not going to talk about the undergraduate results today. So I want to show you some results that kind of, I will preview this by saying, fall in a somewhat routine category. We asked, how many questions, Rudy, were on the survey altogether? Dozens and dozens of questions, approximately 45 minutes to an hour to complete the survey, and lots and lots of questions and lots of data and results. And we have examined a lot of these results, and of course what you do as a scientist or a social scientist is you look for things that are interesting or surprising or confirmatory. You try to put your prejudices aside, but that doesn't always work. But let me just show you one particular measure of student progress or student support. These are simple. I'm not giving you a kind of uncertainty bounds here, but I will talk about that later. But these are just the percentages of the students that we surveyed who said they had won a fellowship or a grant as a graduate student. So what you see here is that, if anything, you could say that you certainly cannot claim that underrepresented students and women students are disadvantaged in any way in terms of this kind of fellowship, this kind of support. Now, I will say everything comes with a qualification. There are many among the faculty who will say that sometimes external fellowships or grants or support are not the best thing because sometimes they tend to isolate you rather than being paid as a GSR, for example, by someone who's invested in your progress. But in any case, no one can claim that UC Berkeley, and probably any other R1 institution I know of, is disadvantaging women and underrepresented students relative to male majority students in terms of this kind of support. In the population I'm going to show you, it's also interesting that, if anything, the underrepresented students were more senior, at least by the measure of the question, have you passed your qualifying exam yet? And I'll let you keep this one firmly in mind as I show you some of the later results. But again, if anything, we had a relatively large number of underrepresented students, 30%, who said they had passed their quals, and female and male majority students were less likely to have. So if anything, we've got a slightly more senior population of underrepresented students responding to the survey for reasons I don't exactly know. And lastly, and consistent with that, we asked the students if they were expecting their degree within the next year, I believe it was. Now, these numbers are all kind of small, which would suggest that we're taking 10 to 20 years to complete our PhDs here, and suggests that students are very tenuous and nervous when you ask them the question, "Are you about to finish?" They probably have this Pavlovian response of, "Don't ask me, I don't want to say." But in any case, if anything, again, the underrepresented students were indicated that they were probably farther along in their degree progress than the other students, if anything. And again, I don't know exactly why that particular bias crept into our survey. Now, it turns out there was a certain battery of questions that was inserted into the survey, I believe, at the insistence of Colette Pat. And it turns out that this is a group of questions that is rarely addressed, as far as I know, in various surveys that have been conducted on the subject nationally and other institutions. And it has to do with publication. Questions like, have you published a paper in the last year? Have you published a paper as first author in the last year? Have you been a co-author on your advisor's paper in the last year, et cetera? So I think, how many of them were? The half a dozen or so questions of this nature. And they all gave a fairly consistent answer, one of which I want to show you here. This is asking students, have you submitted a paper for publication in the last year? Now recall that if anything, we are surveying a population of students who are if they are underrepresented, they're more likely to be more senior than women students at large and the majority male students. And what jumps out at you here is that for this population, the likelihood of having published a paper in the last year is almost half, not a little bit more than half that for male majority students, even though this population here of underrepresented students is likely to be more senior and farther along in their degree progress. Now, they're doing fine in passing their quals, apparently. They're getting lots of support. Other data I haven't shown you suggests that they're getting plenty of mentoring although we don't query mentoring particularly about the research advisors, or we haven't looked at that very carefully yet. But I want you to think about this. We also took the trouble of estimating the reliability or uncertainty of these results in a 1 sigma sense. So these error bars, thanks to Andrew Epic, he can explain to you exactly how these are calculated, but these basically 1 sigma are about 68% or so confidence bounds. So these are all clearly distinguishably different results in our survey. Okay, I want you to think about this now. Think about the fact that these questions are rarely asked in addressing the issues of diversity. And now I want you to think about when you review applications for a postdoc or a faculty position, what's the first, second, and third thing you look at? It's a publication record. It's the primary filter by which you get to the short list. It's the primary filter by which you form your impression of a candidate about whether they're a serious candidate or not. And it's the one area where we largely don't go in the diversity business, and that is the question of when it's time to publish, the relationship between you and your advisor when you decide whether to publish or not. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, what exactly are the expectations for publication in departments? So this is, I have to say, this is the one, we looked at a lot of data, and this is the one thing that jumped out at us and has motivated us to try to dig deeper. And I want to tell you right now that although this is an eye-popping and disturbing result, we don't fully understand it yet. There are confounding factors that we have not completely explored, and to publish something like this, as you might imagine, requires a great deal of thought and care, especially since this is a Berkeley result and may reflect upon our institution, but I would be willing to bet that it's not different in other institutions. As a matter of fact, we have conducted a similar survey among the Cal Alliance group that involves Stanford, Caltech, and UCLA. And although the data are not as robust, and that survey was even more difficult to execute from the IRB standpoint, human subject standpoint, than on our campus. You ever try to do an IRB for 4 different institutions at one time? Several people in this room deserve a medal for having pulled it off. The data are not as robust, but they do reinforce the overall conclusions that I'm about to present. And this is not, fortunately, this is not the end of the story. So we've tried very hard to control these data and these results for the number of lots of things, like how many semesters did you spend as a GSI versus a GSR? Could that affect this performance? How many semesters of fellowship? Well, you've seen that in terms of fellowships. If anything, underrepresented minorities and women are privileged relative to majority males, at least from the data that we've looked at. Progress toward degree, we are looking at a more advanced group of underrepresented students, if anything, as measured by quals progress. And then we decided to look at this by college. Now, in this particular slide, I've grouped the mathematical and physical sciences and EECS, which includes both EE and CS students, for the same metric. Have you submitted a publication in the last year? And if anything, you'll see that these bars are even more disparate than before. And if I look at just at EECS or just at mathematical and physical sciences, they look kind of the same. So this is where the preponderance of the signal is. Now, what have I left out? These are the data for chemistry. Now, this was kind of startling, to say the least, and also, of course, extremely thought-provoking. And we started, and I'll just show you one more thing, just so you know there's not this bias. If anything, in chemistry, overall, students were publishing slightly less, smaller rate overall than mathematical, physical sciences, and computer science, but no strong bias there. But the difference between this and this is enormous. In my limited social science experience looking at social science survey results. Why is this? Is this real? Well, the n's are pretty large in each one of these segments, and you can see that by the uncertainties here, that this indicates that these are not resolvably different performances within the college. This is a college of chemistry, by the way. It includes chemical engineering and chemistry, because we have this lovely, unique situation at Berkeley, and we decided we'd just do them both at once. And obviously, these error bars indicate that these are also very resolvable. These are, in fact, very resolvable differences in the survey that we have. So when you see something like this, you start to dig and question. And I will give you a little bit of a hint of our thinking before I move on to some additional data. It turns out that when you talk to at least some members and leaders in the chemistry department, and Ira Young, who spent a lot of his career in chemistry, you get the sense that there is something different about the field of chemistry. And that is that it may be that the expectations for publication are more explicit. If you want to think of it as kind of tough love, you can, but that there seems to be a much more clear expectation in that field about when and how much students should publish in the course of their career than in other fields. And I can speak, I don't think Steve will mind my saying that in physics, these are not clear expectations, and in mathematics and in my own field, in earth and planetary science, these expectations are not so clear. We haven't really been able to probe EECS yet. And so we have begun to look at this a little bit, but I have to say that as we dug into this hypothesis, it hasn't held up entirely. But on the other hand, this result, when I said that our results held up across the California Alliance, the difference between chemistry and the other fields also held up across the California Alliance. And the dean of the graduate school at UCLA, Robin Garrell, happens to be a chemist and was quite supportive of the idea that chemists are ruthless and explicit about their expectations for students publishing papers. So it's an interesting hypothesis. And I'll get back to some more hypotheses and a little bit more of what might be the underlying psychology in a minute. But I want to show you some additional data. Thank you again to Andrew Epic and also Andrew Smith, who is an analyst in the grad division. It turns out that Berkeley has other data and has been collecting other data for decades that are relevant to this. There is a required PhD exit survey for all students getting their PhDs at Berkeley. Joe knows about this. You created it, thank you, Joe. And this is a captive audience. Everybody has to take it. So the n's are fairly large, and here are the n's. Even for underrepresented minority students, the numbers in the samples are fairly large. And they ask, among many other things, these 5 questions. Does your department have any organized seminars, colloquia, or sponsored conferences at which graduate students can present their research? Did you ever present any of your research at such a seminar, colloquium, or conference? Were you encouraged by faculty in your department to publish? Did you attend any national scholarly meetings? Did you deliver any papers at national scholarly meetings? So we have these data to look at. And we broke them down along similar lines. And we also computed similar confidence intervals, which if you see a black dot with no confidence intervals, that means they're very small. Okay? So we broke it down into mathematical, physical sciences, engineering, chemistry, and then we also have biological sciences in this particular survey. And question, does your department hold these seminars to make an opportunity for you to speak about your work? It looks like there are no really resolvable differences between underrepresented minority students and white males. Second question, did you ever present any of your research at such a seminar? Well, again, maybe a slight difference for chemistry, slightly less likely for minorities, but nothing really to write home about in terms of resolvability. Question 3, were you encouraged by faculty in your department to publish? Here there are some differences. They're not huge, but except with the exception of chemistry, I note for you, engineering, mathematical, physical sciences, and biological sciences faculty were a little bit less likely to have encouraged their students to publish. Now, the differences may look resolvable, but you're talking about differences between maybe 80 and 90% or between 90 and 95%. So, in fact, most students are being encouraged regardless of their ethnic status. And let's keep going. Did you attend any national scholarly meetings? Yes. And across all fields, students are attending meetings in about equal numbers, equal frequency. Lastly, did you deliver any papers at national scholarly meetings? Now, these students were encouraged to publish equally, more or less, attended national meetings equally, more or less. But in the biological sciences, to some extent, but particularly in the mathematical and physical sciences, actually presenting a paper, which is clearly a precursor to publishing in nearly all fields, the likelihood is 40% compared to, what, 70%, something like that. And in chemistry, Yahoo, the chemists seem to do very well in this regard. So I want to emphasize that we're looking at survey data that involve Berkeley students, but two entirely independent surveys and largely different career stages. These are exiting students reporting on this. I wish, and maybe a grad division will start asking, I wish we actually had data on papers published. That's obviously something with enough people using Google Scholar, you could probably do make quite a dent in that, and maybe if I had a lot of research money, we could do something like that. But everything here is consistent in this one respect. In the BLISS survey, in the California Alliance data, which admittedly are not as robust as we would like, but are at least consistent, and then in this exit survey for PhD students, that in the so-called hard mathematical, physical, and perhaps computer sciences, that for some reason, students are not publishing at the same rates, even though, if anything, they are more advanced students in these fields. And I would say that the primary thing I'd like to say, if we're going to have some conclusions in this talk, is that we believe these results are indicative of a problem. And we know that if they are indicative of a problem, that this will have a very deleterious impact on the competitiveness of these students to fill the highest ranks of the professoriate and the elite postdoc positions that lead to positions of influence in our field. And that is something that we need to fix. And obviously, I think you could see that if this gap were changed, it would be transformative, probably, in the outcomes for our underrepresented students who leave Berkeley, and the question of whether or not they have the opportunity or are encouraged to pursue academic careers. So I want to say, I think I want to touch on, well, I want to say a little bit about what we need to do. And then I'm going to touch on one thing, one aspect of the psychology going forward that Rudy is an expert in and interested in, and he may want to chime in as well. But let me tell you first what we would like to do. We need to beat on the data a good bit more. When as Saul Perlmutter has said several times in talks, the more remarkable and surprising your result, the harder you are obligated to work to break it. And effectively what we've been engaged in the last 9 months is, since we first saw this result, is trying to find everything out possible that could be wrong with it. And we're kind of getting to the end of that process, I think. We also need to have a better quantitative analysis of this career stage bias question, which we're not absolutely certain of yet, and some other confounding factors. For example, the fact that not all the students who answered the question about whether they've taken their quals answered the question about whether they're publishing. So when we compare those data, those statistics, it's a little bit confounding. We really need to understand this question of field-specific culture. For example, chemistry versus mathematics, or it could be experimental versus theoretical fields where we're in a large experimental group, expectations may be more clear. Are local versus national? Do these trends really hold up nationally? We need to repeat these surveys so we get some longitudinal data and, of course, more data. we need to certainly start to approach the question, kind of the inner sanctum of the relationship between research advisor and student, and how those conversations, sometimes difficult conversations, take place. In fact, there's a literature developing around the phenomenon called failure to warn, which indicates, for example, that white male faculty like myself might in fact be less likely to warn a woman or an underrepresented student if their progress is not satisfactory for fear of being perceived as biased. These things cut all sorts of different ways, okay? But basically, to start to get data and to start to work with faculty to understand what's going on here better. And then kind of on the theoretical side, in terms of psychology, just to try to learn what factors may be affecting these outcomes. So let me tell you about one of them that Rudy has pointed me to by Dovidio and Gaertner from 2000, called Aversive Racism and Selection Decisions. They looked at there were two different studies, 1988 and 1998, 10 years apart, and participants in the study were given the CVs, resumes, if you will, of candidates for certain positions. Some of them were very weak, some of them were very strong, and some of them were ambiguous or in the middle. And there was information in the CVs that would allow the students involved in the survey to judge whether or not a student was black or white. These are all black or white indicators by name or by the student clubs or fraternities they belong to and so forth. And then they evaluated the strength of their qualifications. They made a recommendation as to whether they should be hired or not, and they indicated the strength of their recommendation. And here are the results from that particular experiment. If a candidate's qualifications on paper were undeniably strong, within the uncertainties of the survey, they were equally likely, black or white, to be recommended for hiring. If their qualifications were clearly lacking, over here on the right side, weak, then the same. It looks like red is higher than blue, but it's not resolvably different. However, if the qualifications are ambiguous, then the implicit bias, if you will, or the tendency to judge by other factors creeps in. And clearly the white students were much more likely to be recommended than the black students, even though they were otherwise on paper of equal qualifications. Now, how is this related to what we just talked about? Well, the whole thing is ambiguity, the vague road to publication. Ambiguity provides fertile ground for the expression of prejudice. And not only in judgment of others, but in the case of publication, I would put this kind of the other way around, which is that people who come into the academy with less social capital or cultural capital regarding, for example, their parents may not be professionals or professors. They may come from an institution that they may be equally qualified, but they may come from an institution where the ideas around implicit notions about the importance of publication are not as clear to them. And in that atmosphere of ambiguity, they don't know the hidden handshake unless somebody tells them very explicitly. But in regard to publication, everything's ambiguous. You know, whose idea was it? What are the methods? What are the findings? When should it be written up? Who should write it up? When is it time? When are you mature enough? How many papers should you publish as a graduate student, et cetera? So this is just one avenue, and by no means the only avenue. It's the only straw we've been able to grasp at in terms of what chemistry might be doing right relative to the other sciences. And I put this out there only as an indication of the struggle we're in to try to understand these data. And I want to end on that note because that leaves 15 minutes for you to all give me good ideas. So thank you very much. Questions?
Just a point of information. When you said hiring, does that include industrial organizations or only academic organizations?
Well, for the data I just showed was a hypothetical psychological experiment. I think they were ostensibly reviewing candidates to be hired for counseling positions. Is that correct, Rudy? So this was not even STEM necessarily. This was a psychology experiment on some Northeastern liberal arts college campus. Oscar, you had a question?
Yeah, this is, of course, extremely interesting. From the engineering corner, I have a question about two data points. One is engineers, at least in the EEC side, tend to have a much lower share percentage of respondents submitting a paper, but then they have the highest response and not separable for presenting at national conferences. So I wonder if you're taking into it's extreme on both sides in a sense.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if in that case, if there's an issue of the degree nature. So in some fields in engineering, presenting at a conference is much more important than submitting a paper, for example.
Right. Well, conference proceedings are treated different in engineering, and I'm worried about that.
And there's also, I think, what happens after the degree is different. You know, paths towards industrial, professional types of jobs, and what are the desired attributes of candidates for those types of career paths. Have you given any thought about in terms of just in this case where EECs plus MPS much lower for URMs submitting papers, but when you look at presenting at national conference, no difference between males and URM, and they're the highest. Mm-hmm. To me that's something I would be interested very much in.
Yeah, I think these two surveys are designed independently, and it turns out neither one asked quite the right questions. And then you'll try to look at the intersection of them, and you have to be careful about it. I've worried in particular about this problem that in CS in particular, my understanding is that conference proceedings are treated like real publications, and in my field they're not. And so there are somewhat different standards for how you get judged come job application time. But I'm particularly interested in what differentials exist, between minority students and majority students, and those seem to hold up anyway. Dan?
So I think the line of following, the idea of getting more deeply into the relation between the student and advisor or mentor is probably the right one. So one thing that strikes me is that you can see whether you can ask yourself whether a student from an underrepresented minority is more central or peripheral to a research group. To be pushed to get to the point of publication, are they getting a lot of very individual attention from the research advisor? Are they involved in that person's research so that when the advisor, of course, is publishing, then that person is also on the part of the effort and an author. And then secondly, with regard to giving talks at national scientific conferences, that often occurs because I, as an advisor, would give a student a real vote of confidence. I would be invited to some kind of meeting. I would say, well, how about you invite my student instead? How about this person? Mm-hmm. And so then it becomes everything else about passing quals and getting fellowships and getting through everything. That's sort of a community-wide or a department-wide assessment of the person. This is finally like the personal assessment of the person's research advisor. Are they really top-notch? And would I be proud to have them represent me? And part of that can be, again, this sort of outsider status. Maybe I don't recognize them for their qualities. Maybe it's part of the, having a lot of white male professors in positions where they don't, really pull people into the club, as it were.
I agree with all you said. But, let me expand just slightly and make kind of a bold statement. I think if you ask most faculty about this question of, what are the expectations for publication in your field, in your group, how should they or how are they communicated to students? I think a lot of faculty, without a lot of thinking about it, would just simply say, well, it's hard to say. It depends on the case. We kind of know when it's right, And there's a certain truth to that. I believe that that there is a lot of judgment, as you know, involved in when you encourage a student to publish, not doing so prematurely, how big a chunk do you publish, what's the authorship role, et cetera. On the other hand, I think this issue of ambiguity is probably much more powerful than most of us realize, because most of us grew up, so to speak, in white male-dominated science departments, where the implicit knowledge and understanding of these norms was perhaps assumed to belong to everybody. And I think that that's almost clearly not the case for students who come from different backgrounds, from sometimes schools that are not R1 undergraduate institutions, et cetera. And so you're exactly right that we've got to get into this conversation somehow between faculty and their students. And in some ways, it's not, I think there's a need for more candor, and that candor is difficult sometimes for across difference, because you are afraid sometimes that you might insult somebody, and that you might be less likely to warn a female graduate student about lack of progress than a male graduate student. It can go different ways. So that's one of the things I think that certainly our group wants to try to understand, because this is kind of sacred territory. That this is really the monastic order coming into play here when you talk about how a research advisor advises a student about publication. Christy, you had something?
Yeah, I'm in chemistry and earth planetary science, so I'm intrigued with these differences and trying to brainstorm on what those could be. And of course, in chemistry, we would really like to know what, if anything, are we doing right. Okay, we're not sure what it is. So one of the things I wanted to follow up from your question was the advisor will fill out for the qualifying exam, which is taken during the second year. Often very early, there are students already taking their qualifying exam. So everybody takes it in their second year. And on that form itself is a question that says, when will your student be expected to publish their first publication? That's an expectation. It's not whether they're going to pass the exam or not. That's just a part of the evaluation that the research advisor, who does not serve in chemistry on the qualifying exam, they write a report to the qualifying exam committee, and it says very explicitly, when do you expect this student to submit their first publication? I think that means there's an expectation that some of them have published one already. You even asked the question, so I think it's a lot of things, but I wanted to bring that one up specifically. Maybe that in and of itself, just asking the question.
I don't know of any other department that asked that question, actually. Thank you.
And usually it's soon. The answer is within the next year.
Well, one of your leading figures in the department said that any student who gets to the end of their second year and isn't writing up a paper knows that they're behind the 8 ball. Now, I don't know if that's just cultural or whether it's explicit, maybe both, but that's different. I can say that is not true in our department, Earth and Planetary Science. I don't believe it's true in math, and I don't believe it's true in physics.
Thank you for this talk. For me, I think there's still some ambiguity in the categories that are used. Like maybe it's having to do with the fact that the N is too small to separate URM and women more, but I'd be interested in knowing if there's disparity that's being hidden within those categories in terms of who the international students are, and breaking up by race, ethnicity, and even socioeconomic status, especially with women. Is that including both URM and white women? Because I'm not totally convinced that fellowship opportunities, you're showing that they are higher for underrepresented minorities and women, but I'm not totally convinced that that's equal across the groups within that category, and that there isn't some actual disparity there compared to white men.
We could probably answer that question. Colette, do you know? Andrew, do you know? Bing, bing, bing.
So we could look at this. I think we haven't yet. I think it'll be, as you noted, it'll be challenging. The more you disaggregate, the the larger your confidence intervals become, but it's definitely worth looking at. I will, perhaps Mark can cut me off if I'm saying too much. Something that wasn't shown here that came out of the survey from the Cal Alliance that he mentioned was not around publication, but around sort of how the sort of climate within departments, and there were definitely big disparities when you look at that intersectional disaggregation for really just women of color in general. But once you split things out, definitely differences are very real. Whether that translates into the publication side, we'll have to look.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for this work. It's very important. I am from the Environmental Science Policy and Management Program Department, and we've been looking at these kind of issues, and I'm really intrigued that you've quantified some of the things that we're seeing in the more qualitative ways. I'm a social scientist myself. And first, I wanted to say that your characterization of this hidden knowledge, there's theories out there called METIS, but James Scott, I think, actually crystallizes this idea of kind of the hidden knowledge transfers, perhaps looking at that. The other thing is, I'm curious, because we've seen this, every department has to provide an equity inclusion report, and I'm part of the Graduate Diversity Council within our department, and we've seen these reports, and they've indicated that where we've seen the diversity of students coming in has been reflected partly with the diversity of faculty. So underrepresented minority students are coming in and working with underrepresented faculty, and I'm curious if that's another way to look at the comparison, because we know that underrepresented minority faculty members are often tasked to do all these non-academic tasks, being on committees, doing some extra service, and they're in high demand from underrepresented minority students because there are so few of them. And similarly, underrepresented students have the challenge of just surviving in spaces where they're a minority and needing to prove that their questions that they're bringing to the table are as important as other people's questions. So I don't know if you can speak to maybe also if you've looked at all in terms of comparing the students who are in these studies, who their advisors are, and as another way to understand the way that these knowledge transfers are coming through, and if there's more disparity for those folks who are working with these minority faculties who are also tasked versus the ones that are
I
not.
can actually give an answer to a large part of your question, which is the nature of confidentiality in the surveys are such that we would never be allowed to identify students with their advisors or with the ethnicity of their advisors, probably. And that has to do with, because the N's are fairly small, you could actually look at data and figure out who's who, and we're prohibited from doing survey work of that nature. So you're talking about a very difficult social science problem embedded. So if Rudy or Colette wants to add to that answer, to the other part of your question, I'm not quite sure where to start.
I'm curious to hear what your... Rudy may have a different answer to this, but I think what you're describing sounds like a really important qualitative research project, and I'm curious to hear what you're doing along those lines. It sounds like that's an area that you're working in. I don't know how if that could possibly yield to quantitative analysis given the small ends, both of the faculty and the students, but it certainly seems like a productive area for qualitative work.
Sheila has been trying to ask me a question for a long time. Can somebody let her speak? Thank you.
Most of the points that I wanted to make have been made, but I wanted to underline what Oscar said. In your sample, did you separate out the people who clearly were not aiming towards academia?
No.
So I think that's an important point particularly for EE and CS, because industry is so attractive now, and particularly the women find it more attractive because they perceive that there's more flexibility in their work life. And accordingly, in the last 5 years, more than half of our PhD graduates, women and minorities, have gone to industry or industrial labs, but mostly just Google and places like that, rather than academia. I also wanted to point out that in admissions in EECS, for example, it's a rare candidate who isn't admitted as a first-year graduate student who doesn't already have at least one publication. And yet, for students who come from minority-serving institutions, they may or may not have had that opportunity. So there's sometimes a lag during the course of their time. And I also wanted to point out that there are certain research groups in computer science that have 20 or 30 people on one research project. So you might get your name on a paper. It might take longer, but it might count for less if you're reviewing that person for an academic job. Whereas my understanding in math is you can just do something by yourself with a piece of paper and a pencil.
It's a quaint idea, yeah.
I don't know, but I also I thought Dan made a very good point, because I've observed over many decades that some of our very talented minority PhD students are at the margin of their research group, because they may come in with lesser credentials as perceived by the faculty, and so it's more difficult for them in this entrepreneurial matching process to get an advisor, and then they may be at the edge, and that can continue. So I think that's a very good point, and I hope you'll look into it.
Let me comment on that and invite Rudy or Colette to remind me of things I may have forgotten. But my recollection is of the many questions we asked in the BLISS survey, we did not get a sense that underrepresented students were being marginalized within their own research groups. Although they did report, for example, if you ask them a question, do you feel more or less identification with your advisor, et cetera, obviously, if that there are differences there. But we didn't find any eye-popping results that would tell us that students are finding an unwelcoming or an isolating environment. And Rudy may want to comment further on that, but that...
Those are your respondents, not those who didn't respond.
Well, of course, but that's the best you can do. Rudy, you want to comment any further on that?
I'll only say that some of the findings we have reflect, I think, what you're talking about, which is there is an inclusion, but it's a little bit of a different type, so that you are included, but you're doing extraneous tasks, and we do have some data to that effect, that you're helping. I think women and underrepresented minorities report helping their advisors more, kind of on a day-to-day basis. I forget exactly the question, and forgive me for that, but there is that sense, and I immediately thought of that when you said that, that they are involved, but you can be involved in and yet continue to be marginalized. With respect to your point about more than half of URMs and women choosing to go to Google, I think that's exactly the issue at stake, because if in fact part of the attraction of staying and being in academia is having a mentor that looks like you, and those potential mentors are going off into industry, that's where that's exactly the problem, that people are not choosing and then not having the publications rather than the papers that will allow them to be considered. So there's no question there's a self-selection process.
I want to ask somebody to comment who hasn't yet, which is Ira. Ira Young spent many years as the chief graduate advisor for the Department of Chemistry. And I don't know if you might want to respond a little bit to what Christy said, or just say a little bit more about the departmental culture from your eyes, because you saw these relationships in your day-to-day work.
I concur with Christy. The atmosphere is pretty structured in chemistry, unlike other departments, as far as the expectation, and that's from starting at the spring visits when the students come in. They kind of understand the culture of the department, and the expectation is made very clear from the SAOs on into the groups. So it's very, very clear what the expectations are. And when the students visit the various laboratories, they get a clear understanding of the expectation of that group as well. So it's really clear from beginning to end.
Thanks, Ira. Yes. Turn this off for 1 minute.
In terms of like what Ira said, kind of like the structure in the department, I'd also be interested in looking at, so some departments have kind of like explicit rotation programs for incoming graduate students. Physics does not. I'm in the physics department. and I believe some departments have non-advisor faculty mentors that so I had a faculty mentor before I joined a research group, but as soon as I joined a research group, like my advisor is now like the only person that officially is supposed to mentor me, and I think other departments may have like non-advisor people or non-advisor faculty who like stay on. Yeah. So I'd also be curious like if either of those things or like kind of affect the structure of the department and how people kind of work through it to publications.
Christy, did you want to answer that?
I think chemistry is more like physics. Once you join your research group, that is who your advisor is. Although we're just forming an ad hoc committee now that to provide some more mentoring for students who want it. But so that's not the secret sauce in chemistry.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, yeah, so thank you again for doing this. This is great, and I feel like this is such useful information to know where some of the problems are so that you can try to find solutions. And we've been thinking about like what to do within Berkeley, but I'm curious also, especially because I have a project about unconscious bias, so that's sort of my baby, but in thinking about like how there is this implicit bias against especially women and people like underrepresented minorities, what can we do like as members of different research associations to try to make more peer review blind to sort of try to fix that problem from a different angle too? Because some journals have gone blind, but most of them haven't still. And I know that differs field to field, but that might be another way to try to say like, hey, this is where there's a big problem. Maybe we can try to get at it that way too.
Let me answer your question with a little bit of caution. And this is kind of one of the lessons I've learned as a naive scientist, putting my toes into social science. I don't think that our results show evidence for bias, necessarily. It is possible that they reflect bias, but there's nothing in the data that suggests bias. And for example, if we follow this hypothesis about chemistry, about which I'm also equally cautious still, and we accept maybe that's part of the explanation, that's not necessarily bias in what I consider the classical sense of either consciously or unconsciously disadvantaging an underrepresented minority. It reflects instead a practice on the part of chemistry that may mitigate prior circumstances, lack of preparation, differences in kind of cultural, social background coming in. And I say that because I think one of the things we have been trying to do in our projects overall, and I think that is unique to Berkeley, is we've been trying to bring faculty to work with us and not just kind of prescribing things for them. And the less our faculty feel like there is an implicit accusation of bias, the more likely they are to work with us and to try to understand these factors that we're talking about. So I don't mean to criticize your comment, but I would just say that I think it's important to be cautious about that, because, and that also leads me into one statement I had intended to make. If we have the chemistry hypothesis correct, the good news is that this is an incredibly inexpensive thing to fix. Of all the money we spend on diversity and studying diversity and so forth, if the graduate division were to simply come out and say the departments need to articulate their expectations for publication more carefully, and here's how you can do it, and if that solves 80% or some even significant fraction of the problem, that would be pretty cool. And you don't have to, again, that is not necessarily bias, but it may be undoing of previous effects of bias or just different social and cultural backgrounds. I hope I'm clear about that.
Let's thank
Thanks very much. Thank you, Carol.